Hey you guys, so we're starting on part 2 of The Secret of Platform 13, and we're just learning all about the Secret Cove and a Gump. There was always excitement before the opening. In the harbor, the sailors made the three-masted ship ready to sail to the Secret Cove. Those people who wanted to leave the island started their packing and said their goodbyes, and the rest houses were prepared for those who would come the other way. It was now that homesickness began to attack Lily and Violet and Rose. Homesickness is a terrible thing. Children at boarding schools sometimes feel as though they're going to die of it. It doesn't matter what your home is like. It's that it's yours that matters. Lily and Violet and Rose loved the island and they adored the prince. But now they began to remember the life that they had led as little girls in the shabby streets of North London. "Do you remember the bingo halls?" asked Lily. "All the shouting from inside when someone won? And Saturday night at the Odeon with a bag of crisps?" said Violet. "The clang of fruit machines in the Patty's parlor?" said Rose. They went on like this for days, quite forgetting how unhappy they had been as children, teased at school, never seeing a clean blade of grass, and beaten by their father. So unhappy that they'd taken to playing in King's Cross Station and had been there when the door opened in the Gump and couldn't go through it fast enough. "I know we can't go up there," said Lily, "not with the prince to look after, but maybe their majesties would let us sail with the ship and just look at the dear old country." So they asked the queen if they could take the baby prince on the ship and wait with him in the secret cove, and the queen said no. The thought of being parted from her baby made her stomach crunch up so badly that she felt quite sick. It was all because she minded so much that she began to change her mind. Was she being one of those awful drooling mothers who smother children instead of letting them grow up free and unafraid? She spoke to the king, hoping he would forbid his son to go, but he said, "Well, dear, it's true that adventures are good for people even when they are very young. Adventures can get into a person's blood, even if he doesn't remember having them. And surely you trust the nurses." Well, she did, of course, and she trusted the sailors who manned the ship. And the sea air, as everyone knows, is terribly good for the lungs. So the nurses agreed and had a little weep in her room. So she agreed and had a little weep in her room, and the nurses took the baby aboard in his hand-woven rush basket with its lace-edged hood and settled him down for the voyage. Just before the ship was due to sail, the queen rushed out of the palace, her face white as chalk, and she said, "No, no, bring him back. I don't want him to go." But when she reached the harbor, she was too late. The ship was just a speck in the distance, and the only gulls echoed her tragic voice. Chapter 2. Mrs. Trottle was rich. She was so rich that she had 11 winter coats and 5 diamond necklaces, and her bath had golden taps. Mr. Trottle, her husband, was a banker and spent his days lending money to people who already had too much of it and refusing to lend it to people who needed it. The house the Trottles lived in was in the best part of London beside a beautiful park and not far from Buckingham Palace. It had an ordinary address, but the tradesmen called it Trottle Towers because of the spiky railings that surrounded it, and the statues in the garden, and a flagpole. Although Lorena Trottle was perfectly strong and well, and Landon Trottle kept fit by hiring a man to pummel him in his private gym, the Trottles had no less than 5 servants to wait on them: a butler, a cook, a chauffeur, a housemaid, and a gardener. They had 3 cars and 7 portable telephones, which Mr. Trottle sat on sometimes by mistake, and a hunting lodge in Scotland where he went to shoot deer, and a beach house in the south of France, with a flat roof on which Mrs. Trottle lay with nothing on as to get a suntan, which was not a pleasant sight. But there was one thing they didn't have. They didn't have a baby. As the years passed and no baby came along, Mrs. Trottle got angrier and angrier. She glared at people pushing prams. She snorted when babies appeared on the television gurgling and advertising disposable nappies. Even puppies and kitties annoyed her. Then, after nearly 10 years of marriage, she decided to go and adopt a baby. First, though, she went to see the woman who had looked after her when she was small. Nanny Brown was getting on in years. She was a tiny, grumpy person who soaked her false teeth in brandy and never got into bed without looking to see if there was a burglar hiding underneath. But she knew everything there was to know about babies. "You better come with me," Mrs. Trottle said, "and I want that old doll of mine." So Nanny Brown went to fetch the doll, which was one of the large old-fashioned ones with eyes that click open and shut, and lace dresses, and cold china arms and legs. And on a fine day toward the end of June, the chauffeur drove Mrs. Trottle to an orphanage in the north of England. And beside her in the Rolls Royce sat Nanny Brown, looking like a cross old bird, holding the china doll in her lap. They reached the orphanage. Mrs. Trottle swept in. "I've come to choose a baby," she said. "I'm prepared to take either a boy or a girl, but it must be healthy, of course, and not more than 3 months old, and I prefer to have fair hair." The matron looked at her. "I'm afraid we don't have any babies for adoption," she said. "There's a waiting list." "A waiting list!" Mrs. Trottle's bosom swelled so much that it looked as if it was going to take off into space. "My good woman, do you know who I am? I am Lorena Trottle. My husband is the head of Trottle and Blatherspoon, the biggest merchant bank in the city, and his salary is £500,000 a year." The matron said she was glad to hear it. "Anyone lucky enough to become a Trottle would be brought up like a prince," Mrs. Trottle went on. "And this doll which I have brought for the baby is real antique. I have been offered a very large sum of money for it. The doll is priceless." The matron nodded and said she was sure Mrs. Trottle was right, but she had no babies for adoption, and that was her last word. The journey back to London was not a pleasant one. Mrs. Trottle ranted and raved, Nanny Brown sat huddled up with the doll in her lap, and the chauffeur drove steadily southward. Then, just as they were coming into London, the engine began to make a nasty clunking noise. "Oh, no, this is too much," raged Mrs. Trottle. "I will not allow you to break down in these disgusting, squalid streets." They were close to King's Cross Station, and it was 11 o'clock at night. But the clinking noise grew worse. "I'm afraid I'll have to stop at this garage, madam," said the chauffeur. They drove up by one of the petrol pumps. The chauffeur got out to look for a mechanic. Mrs. Trottle in the back seat went on ranting and raving. Then she grew quiet. On a bench between the garage and a fish and chip shop sat a woman whose frizzy red hair and long nose caught the lamplight. She was wearing the uniform of a nursery nurse, and beside her was a baby's basket. A basket most finely woven out of rushes whose deep hood sheltered whoever lay within. The chauffeur returned with a mechanic and began to rev the engine. Exhaust fumes from the huge car drifted towards the bench where the red-haired woman sat holding onto the handle of the basket. Her head nodded, but she jerked herself awake. The chauffeur revved even harder, and another cloud of poisonous gas rolled towards the beach. The nurse's head nodded once more. "Give me the doll," ordered Lorena Trottle, and got out of the car. Now, for 8 days the nurses had waited on the ship as it anchored off Secret Cove. They had sung to the prince and rocked him and held him to see the seabirds and the cliffs of their homeland. They had taken him ashore while they paddled and gathered shells, and they had welcomed the people who came through the Gump as they arrived in the mouth of the cave. Traveling through the Gump only takes a moment. The suction currents and strange breezes that are stored up there during 9 long years have their own laws. And people can form themselves into wind baskets into which people can step and be swooshed up or down in an instant. And it's a delightful way to travel, but it can be muddling for those not used to it. And the nurses made themselves useful helping the newcomers onto the ship. Then, on the 9th day, something different came through the tunnel, and that something was a smell. The nurses were right by the entrance of the cliff when it came to them, and they sniffed it up, their eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Lily," said poor Violet, and her nose quivered. "Oh, Rose," said poor Lily, and clutched her sister. It was the smell of their childhood, the smell of fish and chips. Every Saturday night their parents had sent them out for 5 packets, and they carried them back, warm as puppies, through the lamplit streets. "Do you remember the batter all sizzled in gold?" asked Lily. "And the soft whiteness when you got through to the fish?" asked Violet. "And the way the chips went soggy when you doused them with vinegar?" said Rose. And they stood there and thought they would die if they didn't just once more taste the glory that was fish and chips. And that's where we'll stop for today. Bye, guys.